For many years after it held its first multiracial elections in 1994, South Africa was seen as a poster child for peaceful reconciliation and the triumph of good over evil. Lots of people assumed that if a country could emerge from division and brutality intact, without bloodshed, ethnic cleansing, or partition, then surely it had something to teach the world. Other societies healing from the wounds of war looked to its Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a blueprint. Pretoria offered itself, or was called upon, as a peacemaker. The Rainbow Nation image brought tourism, international investment, and major global events like the 2010 World Cup. But beneath the glitz, there was a darker side: grinding poverty, widespread corruption, violent xenophobia, and close ties with authoritarian regimes. These days, South Africa seems intent on restoring its international image as a moral superpower. And earlier this year, in the eyes of many countries, it did just that.
Some have told us that we should mind our own business and not get involved in the affairs of other countries. Others have said it was not our place. And yet it is very much our place. We as South Africans will not be passive bystanders and watch the crimes that were visited upon us being perpetrated upon other people elsewhere.
Welcome to Counterpoint. Each week, we'll look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky, a deputy editor at Foreign Policy and your host and moderator for the show. Today, we're going to tackle the question, can South Africa be a moral example to the world? Here to answer yes is Sisonke Msimang, the author of the books Always Another Country and The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela. And to argue that South Africa is not a moral example is Tony Leon, the former head of the Democratic Alliance, known as the DA, and leader of South Africa's official opposition in Parliament from 1999 to 2007. Counterpoint is a foreign policy podcast in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Earlier this year, South African lawyers prepared and argued a case before the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. They accused Israel of genocide in Gaza, and an overwhelming majority of the judges issued a provisional ruling in South Africa's favor. People across the global south applauded, and South Africa's lawyers received a hero's welcome when they arrived at the airport in Johannesburg. Sisonke, I don't want to debate the merits of the case here, but does South Africa deserve praise for bringing it?
Yes, I think South Africa absolutely deserves praise for bringing it for a number of reasons. I think the most important one is that South Africa took up its historical role as a sort of beacon of moral authority. It was able to say that no one in the West is prepared to stand up to the big giants, to America, to the UK. No one is prepared to take a side that challenges what Israel is doing. And that historically, that role has been taken by countries that are smaller, the non-aligned movement, etc. And so in many ways, I think what South Africa was doing was being the right voice at the right time.
You say the right voice at the right time. What do you mean by that?
So I think what I'm really referring to is clearly the history of Nelson Mandela, that Nelson Mandela was someone who spoke with a moral clarity, with an authority. We had South Africa many times spoken about as a corollary to Palestine in terms of an occupied land, in terms of people who have historic connections to one another. And Mandela said many times that South Africa's freedom is not complete until Palestine is free.
Tony, I imagine you disagree. Why do you think other countries should not look to South Africa as a moral beacon in this case or others?
I think, first of all, that South Africa's moral voice internationally has been inconstant, erratic, and very often consists of gesture politics where means are not joined up to ends. And what do I mean by that? Well, of course, there were brutal bombings of Palestinian or Hamas targets in which Palestinians were killed. And of course, South Africa and any other sovereign country has a right to defend oppressed or marginalized people anywhere. That to me is not in dispute. What is in dispute is using an instrument like the International Court of Justice to bring a claim of genocide, that Israel had a genocidal agenda, or has one, against an entire people or population. But the problem isn't the location of sentiment or solidarity, which Sisonke correctly referenced. It's really what the democratic government of South Africa has done since the end of apartheid and it assumed power. And, there's a pretty grim roll call it inconsistency would be an understatement. In 2015, the South African government arranged for the so-called butcher of Darfur, Omar al-Bashir, the head of Sudan at the time, to exit the country, even though an international court with complete legitimacy to which South Africa was a signatory member had ordered his arrest. So we use public international law when it suits us, and more cases than not, we actually defy it. The basic silence on Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago is a reference point here, as is our greenlighting of stolen elections, whether they're in Venezuela or Zimbabwe, where a political ally of the ANC has done the vote rigging. So I think that undermines any of your historical, legitimate claims to public international law credibility.
So, Sisonke, going back to the reaction in South Africa after those lawyers came back, there was the sense at the airport, in the streets, a sort of nostalgia for the 1994 days, a sort of pride in the country. Is that something that you felt? And how does that sit alongside the other cases that Tony just mentioned? Was the ANC right on Israel and Gaza, but misguided everywhere else?
So I was in South Africa at the time when the lawyers were arguing the case at the ICJ, and everyone was talking about it in the streets. There were large screen televisions set up in shopping centers. So it was a constant sort of happening in the background, and it was something that people were talking about. And there was a real sense of pride. And there was something unifying about South Africa being at the ICJ. So it did feel nostalgic. In respect of the cases that Tony, spoke about, I could not agree with him more. I was an activist, a human rights activist. I wrote a long piece, an op-ed piece in the New York Times when the al-Bashir case was unfolding. So I am in complete agreement with Tony. At the same time, of course, just because South Africa has been hypocritical when it comes to some of its actions about human rights doesn't mean it's wrong when it comes to Israel and Gaza. And in fact, unfortunately, what we see on the international stage is hypocrisy all around. So if the US and the UK can be hypocritical, unfortunately, sadly, I will have to accept that my own government can also be hypocritical.
I want to shift gears a bit now. I should also mention that even though I don't sound like it, my family's from South Africa, and I spent quite a bit of time there during the 90s. And to really understand how South Africa is viewed on the global stage, we have to look at what's happened at home. It wasn't at all a foregone conclusion that the transition from apartheid to democracy would be peaceful. There was a tense period of constitutional negotiations accompanied by widespread political violence. And Nelson Mandela, the leader of the African National Congress, negotiated an end to apartheid, but did not secure the large-scale economic redistribution that some members of the liberation movement had demanded. Tony, I wanted to ask you, do you think the bargain Mandela struck in 94 was flawed?
No, I'm old enough and ugly enough to have been in those negotiations, so I was a participant and eyewitness. That was the best deal that was available because it was, if you like, in political or even revolutionary terms, a stalemate. I mean, the military power was still very much with the exiting South African government. And if de Klerk had not been de Klerk, but had been more in the mold of his predecessor, P.W. Botha, and dug in his heels, I mean, who knows where this country would have gone. And indeed, there was a lot of violence accompanying that period as well. As to quote Joe Biden in the context of the Middle East, you've got to take the win. And I think the ANC broadly achieved all it set out to do, which was to obtain majority rule and to embed itself in a democratic constitution where most of the power, not all of it, would rest with the governing party. I've always thought, and I've written about it several times, that you've got to actually look at it from the other side. There was de Klerk, who had inherited 46 years of undiluted power, who was actually relinquishing power. Well, he and his party and his supporters weren't going to do that without some guarantees. So whether the guarantees were good, bad, or different, illusory or real, that was the basic bargain.
So, Sisonke, what do you think Mandela got wrong, and why was that bargain in 1994 flawed, in your view?
What Mandela and the African National Congress did in 1994, I think, is they underestimated how much support they had and how much they could push for in negotiations. And so what you had was this agreement that was brokered in which it seemed that if the ANC didn't compromise on land rights and insisted, in fact, that the state had a right to expropriate land as per the Constitution, there was a very strong feeling that the apartheid regime, the people on the other side of the negotiating table, would walk away. And I think that's wrong. So one of the interesting things that happened in the early 1990s was that de Klerk, who was then the president of South Africa, did a referendum. White people got to vote yes or no. Do you want us to move forward with this series of changes that will lead South Africa to become a one-person, one-vote society? And white people overwhelmingly said yes. More than 60% of white South Africans voted yes, which meant that after that, there was no turning back. De Klerk had a mandate. And so I think the compromises that were made, particularly around land, were ill-advised and ill-informed, and they came from a sense of cautiousness and pragmatism that 30 years later, I'm not sure were well-deserved. And I think the reason that arose is because there was this real preoccupation with forgiveness. And so I think that was the other major concession. And so what you had was Black people insistent that they would forgive the former colonizers for all of their crimes, and that would take the form of these extraordinary acts of grace. So Nelson Mandela becomes the patron saint of forgiveness. And all Black people in South Africa are now in the position where we have to say, we know you did the wrong thing, but for us to move forward together into this bright future, we need to forgive you. And sometimes that forgiveness was given too hastily. Sometimes that forgiveness was not done with the full facts. Sometimes that forgiveness was given without white people on the other side asking for that forgiveness. And I think that compromise has led to a bitterness that continues to linger in South African society, a sense that not everything has been resolved in the way that we had hoped it would.
Let me just follow up on that, Sisonke. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Truth and Reconciliation process, known as the TRC, and what precisely do you think failed?
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in some ways the cornerstone of the process that led to South Africans ending apartheid and moving forward into a democratic society together. Between 1948 and 1994, there were massacres, there was structural racism. Many things happened in our society that led to the wide gap of inequality between Black and white. Many injustices were perpetrated. And we needed a way to both find out what had happened, and we also needed a way to figure out how to forgive one another and move forward together. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this quasi-legal process that was set up. It had a range of commissioners. I think there were about 15 commissioners. It was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was steeped in this language of forgiveness. And so for 5 years, the Truth and Reconciliation held hearings. There were public hearings. They were run all across the country in many, many different kinds of communities. One of the things that happened, and probably my biggest critique, is that these hearings often became theater. They became steeped in the gestural politics of the moment. So a lot of these hearings became about demonstrating our pain as Black people, but also demonstrating how we could rise above that pain, how we had the moral authority to forgive white people. And often it didn't matter whether or not white people were sorry. And so what that meant in individual cases is that victims, people whose family members had been killed, who had been gone missing, etc., didn't get the kind of justice that they wanted, but that the country as a whole experienced the theater of it as being a notion of justice. And so that was really complicated. And so that, I think, is probably my biggest critique of the TRC.
Tony, what do you make of that argument, that the TRC was more theater than justice?
I agree with a lot of what Sisonke said. I disagree with some other aspects. Let me just briefly respond. Well, first of all, not all white people responded in the same way, either before the TRC made its findings and afterward. During the TRC process, my party, which admittedly didn't have skin in the game, since we, for reasons of never having governed or had a military at our disposal, we didn't have any human rights violations to deal with. We very much championed the process and its aftermath. And I might say our spokesperson on this topic, Dean Smuts, who very sadly died in 2016, happened to be a white woman, but that wasn't the essence of her being. She was highly critical of the TRC for different reasons, or perhaps ancillary reasons to Sisonke, because she basically said all the reparations, or the many reparations that were embedded in the legislation, either didn't happen, or the payouts were measly, or they simply disappeared through a bureaucratic inertia. I might say, when Desmond Tutu presented his report in 1998, it was quite instructive to me that the then three major parties of South Africa, the National Party of de Klerk, the African National Congress, then headed as a party, not as a government, by Thabo Mbeki, and the IFP, very, very critically opposed its findings. So, it's a very, very mixed bag. And maybe it was just, to use Sisonke's phrase, a pragmatic bargain in order to get South Africa to the next stage so it could acknowledge the past but not be enchained to it.
So let's move forward to the present. One of the other forms of reparations is what's known as Black economic empowerment, more widely known elsewhere in the world as affirmative action. Sisonke, why are those policies necessary in South Africa today?
So Black economic empowerment was a policy that was established to recognize the ways in which Black people were locked out of the economy. So it was necessary to have a stake in the economy because Black people had been excluded for, decades from the economy, not just the 4 decades of apartheid, but the many hundreds of years of colonization, British and Dutch before that. So that's why you needed BE. Affirmative action in the South African context is what you refer to when we talk about workplace. So giving a fair shot to Black people, to women who were entering the workforce for the first time. And of course, what you have to understand was that South Africa was, in 1994, inherited this massive gap between Black kids who had been educated in substandard schooling and white people who had the best educations in the world, who had both private schooling, but also had a well-resourced educational sector from primary to high school and then into university. So you needed affirmative action in 1994 to address that gap. And unfortunately, because inequality has not diminished in South Africa in the last 30 years, because it's very difficult to overcome that kind of divide, particularly where you have inheritance. There are all these ways in which that gap widens over time rather than diminishes. And so that's why both policies continue to be important in South Africa today.
Tony, over the years, some people in your party have called affirmative action a new form of apartheid. What do you make of that?
I'm not a spokesman for my party anymore, happily, since others have taken the task. But, that certainly in some ways is a view I subscribe to because, it's the racial blunt instrument of current economic racial redress policies that I think are problematic. And I think the DA approach has been to say, let's use poverty as the yardstick, because if you're going to fixate on racial categories, you're going to have more racial categorization going forward. And so the idea of moving towards a non-racial country where race fades away will never happen because there are so many beneficiaries of using race again as the way of categorizing people. And I think it de-individuates people and treats them entirely on an undifferentiated racial basis, whatever your past performance might be, whatever your levels of poverty. As it happens, overwhelmingly, since most poor people in the country are Black, a non-racial approach to affirmative action would yield outcomes that were disproportionately beneficial to the majority. But that's an argument, if you like, in the abstract. In reality, the latest unemployment figures in South Africa, which just simply reinforces the inequalities and the poverty, are that we have 8 million working age South Africans, 42% on the expanded definition of job seekers who can't or are unlikely ever to get a job. And Sisonke is quite correct to point out that education is perhaps the most reliable access point for people for opportunity, economic opportunity and professional advancement. I was present on a public platform a few years ago with two preeminent women who are very well known to the community here. One is Winnie, who's made a great success in business, and the other person, Mandela Rampela, who had been the vice chancellor of one of our major universities, who both said, entirely unprompted, that the old apartheid system of education, called here Bantu education, was actually better than the present system in the sense the outcomes were less dire. So you've got this double whammy of a very, very inflexible, dirigistic labor system on the one hand, and you have an educational system that has an enormous amount of resources, the highest single item in our national budget, with these very, very bad outcomes. And I absolutely agree in affirmative action, although it depends how you define the categories. We could disagree on that. But in and of itself, you've got to increase the supply side, not just the demand side. Affirmative action, understandably, addresses the demand side. But the supply side comes from very well-executed government policies, primarily in education. And those have really been very, very poor.
So I think the first thing I want to do is just refer back to the comment that Tony made about the education system in the new South Africa being worse than Bantu education. And obviously, what we know is that the Bantu education system was established in order to ensure that Black people didn't progress under apartheid. And in the new South Africa, it's hard to hear a comment like that, regardless of the quality of education, without really thinking about the ways in which the Democratic Alliance, and Tony here as someone who's represented the DA in the past, ways in which the Democratic Alliance often speaks in terms that are deeply provocative along racial lines, that don't recognize our racist history, our racist past, and that comments like that can be easily taken in ways that are offensive to people who recognize the difference between Bantu education, which was deliberately racist and sought to put Black people down, and a new education system, which may be failing for different reasons, but certainly not because it seeks to put Black people down.
You're listening to Counterpoint. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. We'll be right back. Sisonke, let's talk a little bit about the current government. Cyril Ramaphosa was just re-elected president of South Africa a few months ago, but his party, the ANC, didn't get a majority. So the ANC had to form a government of national unity with several other parties, including the DA. Do you think that this current government is solving some of the real problems that Tony just brought up, or is it more the politics of theater that you mentioned earlier?
It's clear that some of it is theater. So South Africans love a good story. South Africans love to be able to talk about how this new government represents a harking back to the way that we originally understood how we would rule one another across racial lines, society moving forward together. So in many ways, there's something nostalgic about calling it government of national unity. It's also very clear that this is about the ANC choosing the lesser of two evils. It was either going to work with the Democratic Alliance or it was going to work with the economic freedom fighters. And the economic freedom fighters are far more radical and were likely, I think, to run circles around the ANC politically if they were in a coalition together. So I think it's a pragmatic, once again, the ANC returning to its roots of pragmatism. The danger for the ANC is that it's seen as finding it easier to work with a small white minority than it does to address the real challenges of the Black majority in South Africa, which it has thus far failed to do. So it's a very delicate balancing act, and it's unclear to me so far how it's going to deal with it, but it's also only 100 days in, and so it's really too early to tell to what extent it's really working.
I would say after 100 days, you can't give a proper answer to that question. I think there is hope and expectation at least, and the negative tropes, which were in many cases deserved about South Africa being on the edge of failed state status, of having been a corrupt wasteland of government's misappropriations under Jacob Zuma, of having missed the opportunity of an economic reset. At least those are no longer the brand ideas associated with South Africa. But on the substance of actual achievement, to me, there are only two measures, and actually go back to the original question you asked, and that is, will this new government, vast in its size, will it achieve progress on two metrics? One, will it actually improve the growth rate? And corresponding to that, will it bring down the unemployment rate? If it achieves those two things, and they're obviously interrelated, I think you can notch up this newfangled GNU, Government of National Unity, as a success. If they fail on that, then it has just been a colossal waste of time, space, and money. And I think will have dire political consequences, not only for the participating parties in this government, but for the whole of the society.
So, Tony, I want to steer this back to foreign policy now. I remember the campaign in 1999. Mandela was stepping down, and you were heading the opposition, running against ANC leader Thabo Mbeki. I dug up a speech you gave back then. You were criticizing the ANC, and you said, quote, "This is a party which wants to dominate the whole of society, to dominate the economy. They want to, indeed, they demand the right to dominate all of civil society." Fast forward 25 years, and you're no longer the opposition leader, but the party you built, the DA, is in a coalition with the ANC. Doesn't that mean that whatever South Africa's foreign policy is right now, warts and all, it's also the DA's foreign policy?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the DA has participated in the breaking up of the hegemon of the ANC, which I think I correctly described in 1999. It became ever more hegemonic. Let me just say this. Structurally, the DA in the government has got no access to foreign policy, except as a participant government. They have no ministry or deputy ministries in the international relations cluster. But you're quite right. They're going to be at some point held accountable. I think the DA, as I understand it, is going to say, well, we're going to stay in the lanes that we've got. And, we started this discussion talking about Gaza and Palestine and Israel, the ICJ. And that was interesting because that's where there's a very sharp divergence between the DA and the ANC. It's a delicate dance, what you do in government and what you say and do in parliament and in the protest actions outside of it. But that's going to be an interesting future reference point for the government and for the party.
Sisonke, even if the DA sort of steps aside or stays in its lane, as Tony said, on foreign policy issues, South Africa does really seem to be flexing its muscles on the global stage when it comes to foreign policy. There was a major diplomatic crisis with the U.S. last year when the U.S. ambassador publicly accused South Africa of sending arms to Russia. Then South Africa staged military exercises with China. And now South Africa is really leaning into a leadership role within the BRICS group, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. And lots of new members have joined BRICS as a sort of new non-aligned movement. Do you think South Africa is realigning away from the West?
I think South Africa is interested in looking as though it's realigning away from the West. And again, if we go back to this notion of gestural politics, to the theater of politics, I think one of the things that the African National Congress learned very well, even before the advent of democracy in 1994, was how important it was to be seen to be doing something. Whether or not you were doing it is a different story. So I would say that in foreign policy terms, South Africa is very much has eyed the vacuum that exists internationally. It has recognized that there is a hypocrisy that many people in the global South are feeling, seeing, sensing. I think the conduct of Israel in Gaza and now in Lebanon in the last year has been so egregiously against international law and the norms and standards of international law, and yet hasn't been called out in the West. And that is making people edgy and restive. And so South Africa finds that it is able to engage in a conversation about how the West is not living up to its ideals in a way that has moral weight and authority, both because of our history, but of course also because South Africa is a middle-income country that can actually afford to send delegations of people to The Hague. The question is whether the South African government will continue to have the level of sophistication to carry that out moving forward. And that's a question of resources. And if the country gets dragged into growing inequality, if we continue to see economic stagnation, unemployment figures are soaring. The structural unemployment is close to 60% among some groups of youth, right? So you have very, very dire domestic challenges, which could rightly distract South Africa from this.
Tony, do you think South Africa is trying to fill some sort of vacuum on the global stage, or is it just building a new anti-Western axis, in your view?
Well, if I was to be cynical about it, I would use that old saying that South Africa wants to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So, for example, we saw this very recently. Now, let's just talk about the United States. And there has been a Trumpification, if he is indeed responsible for it or his movement, of American foreign policy in two respects, which means whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump prevails in November in the presidential election, I think there are two elements of American foreign policy which we're going to see much more of in the next few years. One is deep antagonism towards China and all that implies, and increasing adversarial posture against Iran. I don't think that's going to be much different, whoever is in charge of the White House, and indeed whichever party controls Congress. I think that's almost becoming, although there's some differences, clearly, common cause across the aisle in the US. Having said that, South Africa announced through its foreign minister, Ronald de Mola, that it wanted to improve the quality and the engagement it has with the United States. It wants a deepening relationship, all well and good. But, as an ANC minister said to me during the negotiations that we had recently to form this government, he said, and he's talking about the ANC, our heart is in the East, but the money is in the West. So South Africa, in a sense, is trying to marry these two increasingly incompatible positions. I'm not saying they are utterly irreconcilable, but they're coming harder to manage. Now, maybe, it requires a degree of diplomatic sophistication that if we have it, we're not displaying it.
I don't think that's such an incompatible position, to be honest. And I think South Africa's heart is certainly in the East, but there's a lot of money in the East. And if we neglect talking about China and the very active, very proactive role China has played in the last few years, China has played a big role in building ports, in building airports. The infrastructure of a developing and fast-growing African economy across the continent has really been put in to a large extent by China and to some degree by India. So I think it's not fully correct to say that the money is in the West and South Africa's heart is in the East. I think both the money and the heart of South Africa are in the East. And in some ways, part of the reason why the heart is in the East is because the money is there. So I just think it's important to have that level of nuance involved in the conversation.
So before you two go, and because Tony raised it, the US election is coming. And I want to ask both of you one last question. South Africans know they're the best in the world at a lot of things, like rugby, and that they produce some of the world's most valuable products, like platinum and diamonds. But there's another high-value South African export in the news lately, the world's wealthiest man, Elon Musk. Musk left South Africa in the late 1980s. These days, he's been embracing far-right views and campaigning with Donald Trump. So just going back to our initial question, what do you think it means for South Africa's global image when such a prominent person with South African roots promotes such controversial ideas?
Well, look, Elon Musk had a very unhappy childhood and school days in South Africa. But other than his South African provenance, which Cyril Ramaphosa played on when he met with him recently on the sidelines of the United Nations meeting in New York last month, I don't think Musk is in any sense South African today. So I'm not sure that his South Africanness is in any sense significant of his worldview or reflective of the country, except in its origins. I think far more significant for South Africa, the real dangers that are going to happen to this country economically and diplomatically if Donald Trump wins the election, because we know his views on Africa generally, we know his views on trade, which are very protectionist. And I think it's going to be very bad news for South Africa's trade access to the United States through the current preferential arrangement of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, in terms of future diplomatic engagements and in terms of international amity for the country. I think that's quite independent of the personal origins of Elon Musk.
Fair enough. Sisonke, do you have any views on the U.S. election's impact on South Africa, whether or not Musk has anything to do with it?
Well, I think the less said about Elon Musk, the better, to be honest. Look, I think there's this sense that, Musk embodies the worst stereotypes of white South Africans, that he's entitled, that he's rich, that he's out of touch. And of course, he's been gone from South Africa for such a long time that I don't think he represents anything about us anymore. So, that's my take on Elon Musk. And of course, when it comes to the genocide in Palestine, whether it's a Trump administration or whether it's Harris who wins, America is going to be hostile to South Africa's attempts to bring attention to the plight of Palestinians. I wish that wasn't the case, but whether it's Trump or Harris, we will continue to see very little shift in U.S. policy.
I'll have to stop you there. I'd like to thank both of my guests, Sisonke Msimang, a writer and research fellow at Wits University's Institute for Social and Economic Research, and Tony Leon, South Africa's former opposition leader and author of the book Future Tense. Thanks to you both.
Thanks so much, Sasha, and thanks very much, Tony. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Sisonke, Sasha. Enjoyed it.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Karen Given and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. Join us next week as we debate, should the UK rejoin the EU?
Lots of people in Britain think of us, an island unto ourselves. I'd say that is one of the problems that led us to where we are in many ways.
Brexit itself was not a cause. It was a symptom of an economic system that had essentially failed millions and millions of people.
If you're enjoying Counterpoint, please tell a friend. You can also leave a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps other listeners find our show. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Thanks for listening.